On Sunday, July 25, 1943, during the unfolding campaign in Sicily in World War II, the rising heat, the dust-filled roads, and the sound of artillery framed a moment when success on the battlefield collided with a quieter decision taking shape within the American chain of command, a decision centered on Major General Terry Allen and the celebrated 1st Infantry Division, whose aggressive advance had helped secure vital objectives while also revealing tensions about leadership, discipline, and responsibility inside a rapidly expanding army. Bradley, serving as a senior commander and observing events from both the front and the headquarters map table, weighed reports of bravery, initiative, and tactical achievement against equally real accounts of loosened discipline, independent behavior, and a culture of informal freedom that had grown among soldiers who had fought across North Africa and now battled across Sicily. The day's orders, messages, and after-action notes existed in the very real context of coalition warfare, where American units operated alongside British formations, Italian civilians, and logistical structures that demanded reliability and restraint as much as courage. The hook of this story begins here, not with legend, but with the lived environment of that July day, as Bradley considered whether a commander who had delivered victory could remain in his post while the army prepared for new operations that would define the next phases of World War II. His reflections were grounded in reports from Corps headquarters, conversations with other field leaders, and the practical realities of sustaining cohesion in an army that was learning, adapting, and expanding under the relentless pressure of global conflict during World War II. Within that moment, the question of Terry Allen's future command became inseparable from the broader mission of shaping an effective, disciplined American fighting force across the campaigns ahead worldwide. From the earliest hours of the Sicilian landings, Allen's 1st Infantry Division had built a reputation for aggressive movement, rapid exploitation, and determined assault, and soldiers who marched beneath its insignia understood themselves as veterans shaped by earlier campaigns, confident in their ability to adapt under fire during World II. Their commanders encouraged initiative at the platoon and company level, allowing small units to maneuver flexibly through towns, orchards, and ridgelines while confronting Italian and German resistance that shifted unpredictably across the rugged landscape. Bradley recognized the operational value of this energy, and his written evaluations acknowledged Allen's courage, tactical experience, and ability to inspire his men in difficult terrain. Yet he also studied patterns of behavior behind the lines, where reports from military police and staff officers described episodes of relaxed discipline, celebratory drinking, and informal independence in liberated areas whose civilian populations were still reeling from bombardment and uncertainty. These observations did not erase battlefield achievement, but they shaped Bradley's understanding of the broader responsibilities of command, because in coalition warfare, discipline was not a private matter within one division, but a visible measure of the American Army's professionalism. The educational importance of this moment lies in how it reveals the tension between immediate success and institutional expectations, illustrating how leaders in World War II were required to balance initiative with restraint, courage with accountability, and individuality with the shared standards of an expanding force that needed coherence as much as heroism. For Bradley, the question was not whether Allen could win battles, because he clearly had, but whether his approach to leadership would sustain the army through the prolonged operations that still awaited it across Europe and the Mediterranean during World War II. This tension defined the situation he now faced as command decisions approached fast. Bradley's reflections were rooted in his broader philosophy of command, one shaped by his experience as an educator at the infantry school before World War II, where he had emphasized systematic training, standardized discipline, and the development of leaders who could function within a coordinated structure rather than rely solely on personal style. As the American Army expanded from a peacetime force into a massive wartime institution, he believed that commanders had to model the kind of professionalism that would guide thousands of new officers arriving from training programs scattered across the United States. Terry Allen's charisma, battlefield presence, and rapport with his men were undeniable, yet Bradley worried that the division's informal culture might encourage younger leaders to imitate its excesses without possessing Allen's experience or judgment. The reality of coalition warfare intensified this concern because American divisions were not operating in isolation, but in concert with British commanders, Allied governments, and civilian authorities who closely watched how soldiers behaved in newly liberated territories. From Bradley's perspective, discipline was therefore operational rather than symbolic. It affected local relations, logistical coordination, and the credibility of the American Army in the eyes of its partners during World War II. By studying this episode, students of history gain insight into how strategic objectives, ethical responsibility, and institutional development intersect within a single command decision, illustrating how leaders must evaluate performance not only in terms of victory, but also in terms of the culture that victory reinforces. For Bradley, the measure of a commander extended beyond courage under fire to the capacity to shape an organization that could endure the length and complexity of global conflict. This belief framed every discussion, every memorandum, and every conversation surrounding Terry Allen's future leadership in World War II. It shaped Bradley's choice directly and decisively.
The process that led to Allen's removal unfolded gradually, shaped by observations compiled over weeks rather than by a single dramatic incident, and historically grounded records show that Bradley consulted fellow commanders, reviewed behavioral reports, and evaluated operational performance before reaching his conclusion. Within headquarters discussions, the question was framed not as punishment for a battlefield error, but as a matter of long-term organizational health, because the Army faced future operations that would be larger, more complex, and more demanding than Sicily. Anticipated campaigns across Italy and future cross-channel planning that would require seamless integration between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support within the wider Allied structure of World War II. In this environment, he believed that commanders had to demonstrate strict adherence to discipline in both combat zones and rear areas, ensuring that their divisions projected professionalism to allies, civilians, and subordinate units alike. Terry Allen's leadership remained respected, yet Bradley feared that allowing his style to continue would signal that informal independence and leniency were acceptable norms for American divisions. This fear was not abstract. It reflected the educational reality that armies, like schools or institutions, learn through example, and younger officers often model their behavior on the visible habits of admired leaders. Bradley worried that future commanders, lacking Allen's skill and experience, might imitate his permissive culture without achieving his battlefield success, thereby weakening cohesion at a time when the demands of World War II were only intensifying across multiple fronts. For this reason, the decision he shaped in Sicily emerged as a calculated effort to guide the American Army's development rather than as a reaction driven by personal disagreement or emotion. It reflected his conviction that leadership must reinforce institutional stability throughout World War II. That belief shaped every step of the process itself. When Bradley ultimately chose to relieve Terry Allen, the decision was communicated within formal military channels and accompanied by reassignment rather than disgrace, reflecting the reality that Allen's service record remained distinguished even as his command style was deemed incompatible with future requirements. Historical accounts indicate that Allen continued to serve in other roles, a reminder that relief from command in World War II did not automatically imply failure or incompetence, but could signify a shift in institutional priorities. For the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, however, the transition carried emotional weight because many had developed deep loyalty to Allen and viewed him as a leader who shared their hardships, protected their interests, and embodied the aggressive spirit that had carried them through successive campaigns. The change illustrated how military organizations must often balance individual loyalty with collective responsibility, and it demonstrated to observers across the Allied command that Bradley was willing to enforce standards, even when doing so risked controversy. From an educational perspective, this episode invites reflection on the ethical dimensions of leadership, showing how commanders must evaluate not only what has been achieved, but also what kind of example will guide the future of an evolving army during World War II. The narrative remains grounded in verified historical evidence, emphasizing that the decision to remove Allen emerged from careful deliberation rather than rumor or legend, and that it expressed a broader vision for discipline, professionalism, and organizational identity within the American Army. Through this lens, the relief acquires meaning not as a personal conflict, but as a formative moment in the maturation of American command culture amid the expanding responsibilities of World War II. It signaled the standards that Bradley believed future leaders must uphold. Those standards shaped subsequent operations throughout the continuing conflict worldwide.
In the broader context of military history, the decision surrounding Terry Allen has become a valuable teaching example for understanding how armies evolve under the pressures of global war, because it demonstrates that victory on a single battlefield does not automatically align with institutional goals across an entire theater of operations. Scholars examining World War II often highlight this moment to discuss how strategic leadership requires balancing tactical success with organizational stewardship, and how commanders must sometimes choose courses of action that appear counterintuitive when viewed only through the lens of combat performance. Bradley's removal of Allen after the Sicilian campaign underscores that leadership involves shaping culture as well as achieving results, and that the behavior of one division can influence perceptions and expectations across the entire Allied coalition. The historical record shows that Bradley believed the American Army needed officers who would enforce uniform standards in preparation for years of extended campaigning, rather than cultivate distinct local cultures that might complicate future coordination. This episode therefore invites careful reflection on the relationship between authority, discipline, morale, and effectiveness within large organizations engaged in World War II, providing educators and students with a reality-based case study in the complexities of command. By situating Allen's relief within operational reports, correspondence, and post-war analyses, historians ensure that the narrative remains grounded in evidence rather than myth or exaggeration. It shows how thoughtful command decisions intersected through daily routines, unit culture, and battlefield identity, shaping how soldiers understand themselves and their mission within the vast scale of World War II operations. This reality-oriented perspective deepens appreciation for the complexities of command and highlights how organizational choices influence both present action and future development across the continuing campaigns of World War II operations worldwide as armies kept advancing through new regions. As operations moved beyond Sicily, the lessons embedded within Bradley's decision continued to influence command relationships and organizational expectations, reinforcing the principle that American divisions must maintain consistent standards regardless of location, circumstance, or personality. The expanding theaters of World War II demanded coordination on a scale unprecedented in American military history, involving joint planning with naval and air forces, collaboration with allied governments, and sustained interaction with civilian populations across Europe and the Mediterranean. In such an environment, the conduct of one division could affect not only tactical results, but also diplomatic perceptions, logistical arrangements, and coalition trust. Bradley viewed his responsibility through this wider frame, and his actions regarding Terry Allen were shaped by the conviction that discipline and professionalism were essential tools of strategy alongside weapons and maneuver. Educational analysis of this period emphasizes that command decisions were rarely static or isolated. They were part of an evolving process through which the American Army sought to refine its structure while still engaging in active combat. The reality that Allen's relief occurred in the aftermath of victory illustrates how organizational priorities can diverge from immediate battlefield outcomes, and how leaders during World War II were required to prepare for future campaigns even as current ones continued on. In this way, the episode becomes a prism through which historians can examine the intersection of leadership philosophy, institutional growth, and strategic operational necessity, offering insight into how the American Army balanced present achievements with the demands of an uncertain strategic horizon. Such analysis strengthens understanding of the practical realities that shaped decision-making during World War II, grounding interpretation in documented evidence rather than myth or exaggeration. It shows how thoughtful command decisions resonate through daily routines, unit culture, and battlefield identity, shaping how soldiers understand themselves and their mission within the vast scale of World War II operations. This reality-oriented perspective deepens appreciation for the complexities of command and highlights how organizational choices influence both present action and future development across the continuing campaigns of World War II operations worldwide as armies kept advancing through new regions.
As operations moved beyond Sicily, the lessons embedded within Bradley's decision continued to influence command relationships and organizational expectations, reinforcing the principle that American divisions must maintain consistent standards regardless of location, circumstance, or personality. The expanding theaters of World War II demanded coordination on a scale unprecedented in American military history, involving joint planning with naval and air forces, collaboration with allied governments, and sustained interaction with civilian populations across Europe and the Mediterranean. In such an environment, the conduct of one division could affect not only tactical results, but also diplomatic perceptions, logistical arrangements, and coalition trust. Bradley viewed his responsibility through this wider frame, and his actions regarding Terry Allen were shaped by the conviction that discipline and professionalism were essential tools of strategy alongside weapons and maneuver. Educational analysis of this period emphasizes that command decisions were rarely static or isolated. They were part of an evolving process through which the American Army sought to refine its structure while still engaging in active combat. The reality that Allen's relief occurred in the aftermath of victory illustrates how organizational priorities can diverge from immediate battlefield outcomes, and how leaders during World War II were required to prepare for future campaigns even as current ones continued. In this way, the episode becomes a prism through which historians can examine the intersection of leadership philosophy, institutional growth, and operational necessity, offering insight into how the American Army balanced present achievements with the demands of an uncertain strategic horizon. Such analysis strengthens understanding of the practical realities that shaped decision-making during World War II, grounding interpretation in documented evidence rather than myth or exaggeration. It demonstrates how thoughtful command choices influenced the direction of later operations and the evolving identity of the Army across multiple theaters worldwide in continuation. The story of why Bradley relieved Terry Allen after the invasion of Sicily therefore occupies an important place in the study of leadership during World War II, not because it offers a dramatic battlefield episode, but because it illuminates the quieter, deeply consequential realm of command judgment. Within that realm, decisions are shaped by institutional vision, ethical responsibility, and long-range planning, rather than by immediate emotion, and the case of Allen and Bradley allows historians to trace how these forces interacted within the American Army at a formative moment in its development. Archival documents, wartime correspondence, and post-war reflections present a consistent picture of a decision rooted in reality, built upon observation, consultation, and analysis, rather than rumor or rivalry. For educators, the episode serves as a platform for exploring themes such as professionalism, discipline, morale, and the tension between individual achievement and organizational stability. Students examining this narrative encounter a historically grounded portrait of leadership in World War II, where commanders were required to balance compassion for their soldiers with responsibility to the larger institution. Through this lens, Bradley's action becomes a means of understanding how armies seek to ensure coherence across diverse units while operating under the immense strain of global conflict.
the narrative remains open to continued examination because the issues it raises extend beyond a single campaign, touching upon enduring questions about authority, culture, and organizational growth that persisted throughout the remaining years of World War II and into the post-war era. By approaching the episode as an evolving story rather than a closed conclusion, historians and learners alike can continue to explore its implications for leadership, discipline, and strategic responsibility in large-scale military organizations across differing theaters and changing operational demands throughout the vast trajectory of conflict that defined the period of history. As research and interpretation continue, the decision to remove Terry Allen remains a fertile subject for ongoing inquiry, inviting historians to connect operational records with personal testimony, strategic doctrine, and the evolving expectations of Allied cooperation during World War II. Each new perspective sheds further light on how command authority functioned within the American Army, how standards were communicated across multiple echelons, and how leaders balanced the realities of combat with the demands of institutional accountability. The circumstances surrounding Allen's relief demonstrate that leadership during wartime is shaped by constant negotiation between present necessity and future preparation, and that even highly successful commanders can become focal points for broader debates about culture, discipline, and identity. For scholars and students who approach the subject through an educational lens, the episode provides a structured opportunity to evaluate decisions using historically accurate evidence rather than anecdote, reinforcing the importance of critical inquiry when examining the complex machinery of World War II military organizations. Through continued study, the narrative remains expandable, capable of incorporating additional archival material, comparative analysis with other command decisions, and deeper exploration of how American forces adapted to the scale and scope of global conflict. This ongoing exploration highlights the relevance of the case to broader discussions about institutional learning, demonstrating how armies reshape their internal structures while still engaged in combat operations, and how the experiences of one commander and one division illuminate the wider transformation of an entire military system during World War II. By remaining open to further research and interpretation, the narrative continues to grow, offering new avenues for understanding leadership, responsibility, and organizational change within the vast and demanding environment of World War II. Its themes invite renewed attention as historians revisit documents and testimonies across time within the expanding archive of wartime memory today.
From that point forward, the days that followed in the summer heat of Sicily became a quiet battleground of leadership philosophy inside the United States Army during World War II, where official reports, personal letters, and field evaluations carried as much weight as artillery fire. General Omar Bradley continued to observe the 1st Infantry Division with careful scrutiny, measuring not only its battlefield success, but also the discipline of its ranks, the cohesion of its structure, and the cultural identity that had formed under Major General Terry Allen's fiery and unconventional command. What unfolded was not a conflict between victory and defeat, but between two contrasting visions of what an American fighting force should become during a global war that was far from over. Day after day, Bradley read accounts from staff officers, regimental commanders, and military police who described the 1st Infantry Division as both brilliant and chaotic, fearless in battle, yet unpredictable in garrison. Reports described soldiers who fought with unmatched aggression at the front, but who seemed to carry that same intensity into civilian towns and liberated areas where stricter discipline was expected. To Bradley, this behavior signaled more than isolated incidents. It reflected a command culture shaped by Allen's philosophy of fighting first and regulating later, a philosophy he believed worked in combat but threatened the long-term integrity of the Army. As the calendar moved deeper into August 1943, the reality of the wider war began pressing heavily on Bradley's decision-making because World War II was not confined to one island campaign. The next phases, the invasion of mainland Italy, the build-up for France, and the prolonged attrition expected in Europe, would demand an army capable of sustained discipline as much as tactical brilliance.
Bradley feared that if Allen's command style became a model rather than an exception, the United States Army might succeed in short bursts of combat, but fracture under the administrative and logistical strain of a much longer war. At the same time, Terry Allen's supporters inside the division saw things entirely differently. To them, the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division fought hard because Allen trusted them, respected them, and led them from the front, instead of from a distant command post. Many officers admired his willingness to accept casualties if it meant achieving the mission, and they credited his flexible leadership style with saving countless lives by acting decisively rather than waiting for perfect conditions or textbook procedures. In their eyes, Bradley's concern with rigid discipline seemed disconnected from the chaotic reality of battlefield life. Inside command tents, staff conferences grew tense, quiet, and philosophical. The Army was at a crossroads. Could a commander who inspired unmatched battlefield performance still be considered unsuitable because he resisted institutional conformity? Or did the demands of a modern mechanized army require an evolving standard of leadership that no longer tolerated the frontier style Allen represented? These were not questions of personality alone, but questions about how the United States Army would define professionalism during World War II. Meanwhile, the soldiers of the Big Red Ones sensed that something had changed, even if no formal announcement had been made. Rumors circulated through camps, mess lines, and bivouac areas that higher command was considering a leadership change, and that General Bradley had begun consulting senior officers about Allen's future. Some soldiers reacted with disbelief, others with anger, and some with resignation, but all understood that the bond between Allen and his men ran deeper than typical commander-troop relationships. For many of them, he was not simply a general, he was the embodiment of their identity as a hard-fighting combat division. Bradley, however, viewed that same loyalty as a warning sign. He believed that a division should be loyal to the Army and its mission rather than to one charismatic figure, because in a war as vast and unpredictable as World War II, leaders could be killed, transferred, or reassigned at any moment. If a unit's cohesion depended too heavily on one personality, Bradley feared it might collapse the instant that leader was gone. To him, reforming the 1st Infantry Division now, while it was victorious and intact, was a strategic necessity rather than a punishment. In closed-door conversations, Bradley discussed his concerns with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who weighed the political, operational, and psychological consequences of removing a successful battlefield commander so soon after a victorious campaign. Eisenhower understood both men. He respected Allen's courage and initiative, but he also recognized Bradley's long-term strategic reasoning. The war ahead would not reward reckless heroism alone. It would demand system-wide discipline, logistical precision, and doctrinal consistency across every American unit deployed to Europe and the Mediterranean. As August progressed, Bradley's decision hardened into certainty. He concluded that removing Terry Allen was not an act of retaliation or disapproval of his combat record, but a necessary restructuring before the 1st Infantry Division entered the next phase of World War II operations. The division would continue fighting, but its leadership culture would be reshaped under a new command team that Bradley believed could maintain both effectiveness and regulation in equal measure.
Yet, even as the decision approached, Bradley felt the heavy moral weight of it. He knew that Allen had led his men through North Africa and Sicily with courage and endurance, and that history would remember his battlefield achievements regardless of administrative disputes. But Bradley also believed that wars were not won by battles alone. They were won by armies that could sustain themselves over years of hardship, across continents, under countless commanders and shifting strategic demands. Within the 1st Infantry Division headquarters, officers sensed the atmosphere turning solemn and reflective as staff prepared for an impending change none of them could openly discuss.
Allen himself, aware of growing scrutiny, continued performing his duties with outward confidence, but he privately recognized that the outcome was moving beyond tactical evaluations and into the realm of institutional philosophy. He knew that his style, forged through experience, instinct, and battlefield reality, was increasingly at odds with Bradley's vision for a modern American army. And so, the stage was set for a pivotal moment in the evolving structure of United States Army leadership during World War II, a moment in which battlefield success collided with administrative doctrine, and where the definition of what it meant to be an effective general was rewritten not on the front lines, but inside command decisions that would shape the character of the American fighting force for the remainder of the war. The story continued as the 1st Infantry Division prepared for its next assignment, unaware that the men who had led them through some of the harshest campaigns of the war were now standing at the center of a decision that would resonate far beyond Sicily, influencing how future commanders would be judged, selected, and remembered in the long and complex history of World War II. And from there, the narrative moved forward into the unfolding consequences of that decision, as new leadership began transitioning into place, while Terry Allen and his closest officers faced the reality that their time with the Big Red One, despite victory, loyalty, and battlefield glory, was nearing an unexpected and deeply consequential turning point that would redefine their legacy within the vast and evolving story of World War II. As the transition unfolded, the atmosphere across the 1st Infantry Division shifted into a strange mixture of uncertainty, loyalty, and quiet reflection, because many of the officers and enlisted men sensed that they were living through a turning point in the internal culture of the United States Army during World War II. The men who had marched through Kasserine, Tunis, and Sicily under Terry Allen's aggressive command style now found themselves watching an invisible but undeniable process take place as new authority began to move into the division's operational framework, bringing with it a different tone, a different rhythm, and a different expectation of what wartime discipline should look like. In the days that followed, staff officers began reviewing administrative procedures, training schedules, and troop conduct reports with a sharper level of scrutiny than before, reinforcing the standards that Bradley believed were essential for the long-term evolution of the American fighting force. Patrol rotations became more regulated, leave policies were tightened, and commanders were instructed to emphasize formal discipline even when the division was resting behind the lines. To some soldiers, these changes felt like unnecessary constraints placed upon a unit that had already proven its combat worth, while to others they signaled a professionalization of the division that aligned it more closely with the broader structure of the Army during World War II.
Meanwhile, Terry Allen continued to conduct his duties with resolve and dignity, aware that his future within the division was nearing its final chapter, yet determined not to allow his personal situation to interfere with the operational readiness of the men he had led through some of the harshest campaigns of the war. He walked among the soldiers, spoke with company commanders, and maintained his characteristic presence in the field, even as he understood that command authority was gradually shifting away from him. For Allen, this period represented a conflict not of pride, but of identity, a moment where the very qualities that had defined his success were now being weighed against the institutional demands of a growing global army. Letters written by soldiers during this period reflected a wide range of emotions. Some men expressed admiration for Allen's courage and believed that no other commander could inspire them in the same way, while others quietly admitted that the tightening of discipline might help prevent future incidents that had drawn criticism from higher command. These differing perspectives illustrated the complexity of the situation. It was not a simple matter of approval or disapproval, but a clash between battlefield leadership culture and the structural evolution of a national military institution during World War II. General Bradley, observing all of this from the perspective of operational oversight, believed that the difficult transition was necessary to establish long-term stability within the division.
He saw the 1st Infantry Division not only as a combat formation, but as a part of a larger system that needed to operate under consistent standards regardless of who commanded it. To Bradley, reforms had to be implemented while the division was strong, rather than waiting until future operations exposed weaknesses that discipline alone might have prevented. In his view, preparing the division for the campaigns still to come, in Italy and beyond, required reshaping its internal culture before it entered another prolonged stretch of combat. As new leadership figures began assuming greater responsibility, they faced the challenging task of preserving the fighting spirit that Allen had cultivated, while simultaneously imposing stricter discipline and organizational control. These officers understood that any sudden or heavy-handed attempt to erase the existing culture could create resentment or fracture morale, so they approached the transition cautiously, respecting the division's combat record while slowly redefining expectations. Training exercises began emphasizing coordinated doctrine, logistical precision, and formal organizational structure, reflecting the Army's growing emphasis on systematized warfare as World War II expanded across multiple theaters. For many enlisted soldiers, the shift felt like the closing of a chapter. They remembered the earlier campaigns where Allen's leadership style had encouraged initiative, autonomy, and boldness, and they recognized that those qualities had carried them through desperate situations where flexibility had meant survival. Now, however, they were learning to operate within a more regulated environment, where success was measured not only by battlefield outcomes, but also by adherence to standardized procedures. This adjustment required patience, adaptation, and a reshaping of identity within the ranks. The broader Allied command environment also reflected this evolution. As operations grew larger, more complex, and more interdependent, the United States Army increasingly needed commanders who could function within a coordinated multinational structure. Bradley believed that the future of the war would not be determined solely by daring maneuvers or individual leadership charisma, but by synchronized logistics, unified doctrine, and disciplined formations capable of sustained combat across months and years. The decision involving Terry Allen, in Bradley's mind, was part of this greater transformation. Yet even as this structural shift strengthened the Army's institutional stability, it also preserved the enduring legacy of Allen's leadership within the memory of the soldiers who had served under him. Around campfires, in temporary barracks, and during long transport movements, stories continued to circulate about his presence on the battlefield, his willingness to share hardship with his men, and his refusal to distance himself from the dangers of frontline command. These memories were not erased by administrative change. Instead, they became part of the division's historical identity within the wider narrative of World War II. As preparations continued for upcoming operations beyond Sicily, the 1st Infantry Division steadily adapted to its new command climate. The routines of daily military life became more regulated, inspections grew more frequent, and communications flowed more directly through formal channels rather than through the informal networks that had previously characterized Allen's leadership environment. Over time, the division began to reflect the precise structure Bradley envisioned, a disciplined, efficient, standardized combat formation, shaped not only by experience but by doctrine. And yet, beneath this evolving framework, the human story remained. The soldiers who had fought under Allen, the officers who had struggled with the philosophical implications of leadership reform, and the commanders who now carried the responsibility of guiding the division into the next phase of World War II. Their experiences formed an ongoing narrative of adaptation, institutional change, and the constant balance between individuality and structure within a modern wartime army. As the division prepared to leave behind the battle-scarred landscapes of Sicily and move towards its next assignment, the echoes of this leadership transition continued to resonate through its ranks, influencing how soldiers viewed command authority, discipline, and identity in the midst of a global conflict. The decision that had reshaped their leadership was not merely an administrative adjustment, it was a defining moment in the evolving character of the United States Army, one that would continue unfolding as the division marched forward into the next chapter of World War II.